Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another Monticello live stream. My name is Ashley Hollinsett. I am a guide here at Monticello, and I am joined this afternoon by Toby Smith. She is the Cultural History Interpretation Coordinator for McLeod Plantation Historic Site. Welcome, Toby.
Hello, good to see you. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm glad to be here.
Toby is going to be sharing with us this afternoon a few stories of some of the women who were enslaved at McLeod Plantation, which is located outside of Charleston, South Carolina. Toby?
Well, I tell you, when we talk about women, and this being, of course, the first day of Women's History Month, it's really an honor to keep these ladies and their memories and a precious little girl alive, Ashley. I want to begin with an acknowledgement, if I may, to all of the descendants of McLeod. This is a list of the enslaved with their names on it, and it means so much to us because it reminds us that our work is not yet done, still have some digging to do, still have a lot of stories to tell. But with that being said, I want to start you off with the story of a beautiful little girl, precious and vulnerable. Her name was Leah. Leah would come to McLeod when she was between 4 and 7 years old. She was purchased in 1856. Her family had already been enslaved in McClellanville, which is a beautiful Gullah community about 35 miles away from Charleston. They were forced to walk in a couple from McClellanville, which is 45 minutes by car, to downtown Charleston. Leah would be stripped away from her parents at the old slave mart. And in that process of her parents losing her, we're forced always to think about the journey of children and their involvement in the slave trade. And they were frequently taken away from their parents. And so often in the narratives, it depicts the story. So we don't know exactly how it happened, but we can get a sense that her parents would have been kicking and screaming and fighting for her not to be taken away from them. But she was picked up, put in a tiny little boat, and she would come to McLeod. And when you come and visit us, and we certainly hope that you all will, we'll walk down to the water and talk about that waterway where her tiny feet would have landed. She would have been brought with a rope, most likely around part of her body, and taken to the kitchen. Whenever children were taken from parents, stripped away, and brought to this location or any location, they usually went to the kitchen because the women would try to embrace them, try to comfort them. And so Leah would spend her entire life here at McLeod. She would die in the 1930s, but she would live long enough to become more than just an enslaved child. She would grow up to become a wife and a mother and a grandmother, and triumphantly she would live long enough to see a granddaughter, Miss Maddie. I have a picture of her I want to share with you. This is Miss Maddie's obituary. She passed in 2012, but she would live long enough to see Barack Obama be elected and re-elected President of the United States. Miss Maddie also has upwards of 90 descendants, many of whom still live on James Island. And it means so much to us that the descendants have entrusted us with her family's legacy, with their story. Whenever things happen, we go and ask them, do we have your permission to do X, Y, or Z? When things happen in the community and we know Miss Maddie or Leah are going to be mentioned, we always keep them informed because it's their story, but they are entrusting us to tell it in a way that uplifts and inspires. So when we talk about journeys and we talk about growing through, we always think about Leah, who came here by herself as a baby, but left the legacy that continues to inspire us to this day. As I'm sitting here on the second floor of the house and I'm looking out in the direction of the water, and I'm wondering what she must have been thinking when she first arrived here by herself alone. And so we keep Leah always in our mind and as a reminder of children and their journey along this path. The second person that I'd like to share with you actually lived right above me on the third floor. Her name was Isabella Pinkney. We know from census records that Isabella would come here when she was about 22, possibly, maybe. Can't get it defined exactly because it keeps shifting the data. She was a young woman. She was also a mulatto. Now we don't use that word anymore. Now we say biracial. And because she lived up in the attic, she was subject to rape and sexual assault all day long, as were all women and children, particularly girls who were in situations like this. The thought of not being able to protect the most sacred part of yourself is overwhelming. And when we talk about this on tour, we always acknowledge that this is triggering. And it is also the reality that so many women had to live with. And it was Isabella's story. Out of one of those rapes would come a son, a young man named Daniel. And Daniel is compelling because we have heard from two different sides of the family that one, he was lynched because he was involved with white women and they didn't know his heritage. The other side of the story suggests that he passed completely into white society, went to college, went to medical school, and became a doctor. Now, I know that sounds outlandish, but Isabella survived the war. We have census records showing that she took boarders in her house. She had money. She could have supported Daniel, but we are searching. While we're searching, though, in this discussion of colorism, some amazing things happen on the tour. We frequently have people who break down and sob because they are part of a biracial family. I can't tell you actually how many grandparents pull me aside later and ask, how do I talk to my brown grandchildren about where they come from? So we always recommend sources. We recommend movies. We recommend books. But I tell you, nothing could prepare me for the day when a lady stepped forward and kind of quietly whispered in my ear, in front of the whole group now, Toby, I have been passing as white for 20 years. And my mind went blank. Nothing came out. And she started crying. And the group was looking at me as if to say, well, what is going on here? And all I could think of in that moment actually was, I cannot betray her. I've got to listen to her. So I managed to say, well, let's keep walking. And as we walked toward the wisdom tree, she was telling me this story. And she was there with two friends. And I asked her, are you going to tell your friends? Do they know the truth? And she said, I can't. They won't be my friends anymore. And my last recollection of her is walking away from the group. She didn't stay for the very end. And so when we talk about Isabella and Daniel, we are left with the conversation around colorism and the impact that it still has in America today, particularly as it relates to skin color, hair. Can I tell you how many people ask me, can I touch your hair on the tour? This kind of thing happens. And the way to move us forward is to address it with respect and with dignity. And it's one of the lessons that we take away from Isabella. I'll also share this, Ashley. I had the high honor of meeting her great great granddaughter about 6 months ago. And as I told her the story, she said, well, could I go up there? Could I see where she was? And I took her up there, and she had a difficult time. You know, that space is not very large. It was hot. It was musty. And I think the emotion of dealing with what happened there really, really got next to her. And so I just let her cry. There's nothing else to do but acknowledge it. And when she got done, she pulled herself together and she said, I have to keep going. And of course, we all have to keep going. And so I hope that she took away some of the strength from a lady that she never knew, but who fought to keep herself going and regain her womanhood. And that one day out of her would come this beautiful lady today, Miss Pinkney, and we still keep in touch. Um, the third story that I want to share with you involves a precious lady that we've all come to love so much, Miss Robertsina Gathers. Miss Gathers was born into a very different situation. She was born in the 1960s, but she still was living at McLeod, which is one of the quirky things about this place. You know, McLeod is sometimes called the last plantation because people were here for so long, up until 1990. Miss Gether's family, on the flip side, we've traced them all the way back to about 1824. So they have one of the longest continuous histories here. She grew up and was born, actually born in the 40s. She would leave, however, in the 1960s at the height of civil rights. She went downtown, as you may remember, Burke High School. And from what we've learned here lately, she was a defiant, gun toting young lady who just suffered no, what's that phrase, didn't book fools, right? Um, she laid down the law. But somewhere over the years, she began to mellow. And there was a transition in her life that would pull her toward the ministry. But she also got some education and training as a nurse. And so, in what we can only call an ironic twist of fate, she would come back to McLeod in the 70s when William Ellis McLeod, the last McLeod male to live here, was getting older. He needed a nurse, and she got an assignment to come to James Island. She met him, and he remembered her family. And he remembered that they had been enslaved here as well. So he gave her a job, and she ended up taking care of him for quite some time. But they also worked out a business arrangement, and she rented 3 cabins from him. Cabin number 9, where she was actually born, she turned into a church. And I want to show you a picture of the inside of this. You can see there is a cross. She had a pulpit. You look over to the right. Those were the stained glass windows that she painted. Those green chairs we're still trying to find. And from what we can understand, she had services there every week. She gave away food. She gave away clothing. She helped people find work. Her goal was to change the atmosphere, and her Children of God Ministries did an amazing work. It went on up until the 80s. In fact, she left here in 1986. Miss Gether, sadly, would pass away in August of 2020, and we were so hoping we would have a chance to meet her and maybe even get her to come back. Our former director and friend, Sean Halifax, had a good relationship with her, and he was so close to getting Miss Gethers to come back. But the Lord called her home to glory, and so she's resting now. But her brother comes to visit us, Bishop John Gathers, and we have formed a wonderful relationship with him. And so she's gone, but he's now walking with us the rest of the way. And it means so much when we think about the continuing relationships with the descendants, because truly it means the story has not ended. And we continue to search out those descendants. And so, in celebrating the first day of Women's History Month, we want to remember Leah, that sweet little girl who came here and who, through courage and resilience and a determination for a better future, would grow up to become a fine woman. And then Isabella. And I'm hoping that the end of her life was a peaceful one. I go to graveyards trying to find out where people are resting. And I've not been able to find Isabella as of yet. I'm not going to stop looking because I would like to know. We do know that she remarried. We also know that she had 2 more sons, and we are close to finding a connection to them. And then when we think about Miss Gethers, compassion and kindness, and if anybody embodies grace, she does, that she would come back to a place of pain and try to make it something better for others. And that's the message that we take away. Ultimately, hoping that McLeod could be a place of healing for all people.
In hearing you tell those stories, Toby, it reminds me that when we're looking at the stories of people who were enslaved here in the United States, we're not only looking at stories of violence and oppression, but we're looking at stories, as you emphasized, of survival, of persistence and resilience, especially when we're looking at enslaved women.
It is amazing what they endured. Um, it is often the very toughest part of the tour to talk about not having ownership of your life, not having ownership of your body, and let me go one step further, not having ownership of your own children.
Mhm.
And in reading the narratives, Ashley, one of the things that broke women most often was losing their babies.
Mhm.
They could survive being taken, they could survive even the physical raping, but to lose their babies and never see them again is the thing that would break women most often. So, in these stories, we're looking for the resilience. How did they keep going on? Why did they keep going on? And in some cases, it was the hope of reconnecting with
Mhm.
family. We have a lore, family lore, that Leah, years later, would discover that her parents were only 3 or 4 miles away, trying to close that gap because I'd like to have some documentation on that. But even though they weren't with her, the love of parents sustained her. And ultimately, this story, I think, really touches on a strong sense of people feeling that they belonged somewhere and that they were attached to someone, and it kept them going. At least that's the way we try to present it. They were so incredibly strong. It is remarkable.
One of the things too you mentioned in talking about Leia's story is I think you mentioned she was born near McClellanville
Yes.
and how that was a part of the Gullah community in South Carolina. Can you talk a little bit more about the Gullah culture?
Yes, absolutely. Let's define, too, for those who may not be familiar, right? The Africans who would come here were from Senegal all the way down to Angola and going into the Congo. They eventually, many of them would settle along the Sea Islands. After the period of enslavement, many stayed and formed communities, of which we now refer to as Gullah Geechee. Gullah we talk about as the language of the people. And I like to draw the analogy when all those folks got off those slave ships, they were not speaking the king's English. That would come much later. They were speaking their mother tongues. All of those languages would end up in a big pot to become America's small c, Creole, the Gullah language. Still spoken today, still very much alive, still very vibrant. If you go downtown to the market, get close to those sweet mothers who are weaving those baskets, you'll hear it. You'll hear it in the restaurant. You'll hear it out at Edisto and Wadmalaw and Darien Island and Sapelo. It's still very much alive today. Geechee can refer to the people from either South Carolina or Georgia. You'll hear that used interchangeably. So when you think of Gullah Geechee, and I always say this on the tour, I want to elevate that to the culture, the language, the people, all that good food that America craves came right out of those kitchens. It is what people feel when they come here. And the Gullah people are some of the most remarkable in the world in terms of hanging on to the traditions from Mother Africa that sustain them, the worship, the belief in that we will overcome where we are to something greater. But there was also in that, Ashley, a sense of taking license over situations, which is why sometimes so many of them, even before they made it here, made the decision if I cannot be free in life, I will be free in death. That's hard for people to embrace, but it is all a part of that strength and that resilience and that culture. And so even today in the Gullah community, still close knit, families, everything. We celebrate around preparation of food. We celebrate around saying goodbye to our dead because we don't celebrate, how do I want to say it? We don't mourn the death. We celebrate the life. That is a uniqueness of the Gullah culture. And you see this in the way we say goodbye, in our homegoings, in our funeral. They are reflective of the joy that people had. And so we talk about this. Um, One of the unique things also is that hard times don't shape Gullah people. We shape hard times. That's how we shape it. We manage it and we keep raising children, keep sending children to college, and continue to work the land that has so blessed us. And so this is why the work that's being done by the Gullah Geechee Heritage Quarter is so important, because it is preserving and capturing everything that's going on. And you can still go and visit Gullah communities as they were almost 100 years ago. It is remarkable, but there is a sense of comfort and a sense of home.
Is it safe to think when again, kind of looking back to Leia's story, she's coming from McClellanville, where she would have been likely Gullah herself,
Mm-hmm.
coming to McLeod, where she would have met other Gullah people. Is this a
Yes.
culture that might have been familiar to her in a place where all of the surroundings and the people are different?
Yeah, that's a powerful point, Ashley, because um, if you think of this as a parent or an auntie or whatever role you have in life, the thought of children being taken and put in those situations is overwhelming. So, what we believe is that Leah may have been around a dialect that she knew. She would have been comforted by foods that she had seen her mother and father perhaps prepare, that she would have been familiar with some of the customs and the traditions. And I like to believe, I have to believe, that some strong lady took her in, comforted her, held her, rocked her at night, perhaps sang to her something akin to what her mother would have said. Otherwise, how did she survive?
Mm-hmm.
Somebody showed that child love. Somebody cared for her. Somebody instilled in her a sense of who she could be and who she could become. And we see the other side of it. So I give all the applause to the Gullah community. And, we take people in. You're not an orphan, you're not a stranger. You can always go in the Gullah community and find a meal. Somebody will share a meal, somebody will provide. It is one of the strongest links. And I have to believe that that link got that little girl between 4 and 7 all the way to 97 when she left us.
I'm hearing that theme of survival again and resilience coming through with all of these stories that you're sharing this afternoon.
At some point you think about, as people were ending their day, particularly mothers, their day didn't end.
Mm-hmm.
They had to go home, and wherever home was, prepare something to eat when they most likely were hungry themselves. If they were expecting another life, then that was a whole nother level of consideration.
Mm-hmm.
Then they had to prepare clothing, perhaps wash whatever was available for the children, perhaps darn the knees, the elbows, all of the things that women still have to do after work. They had to do it in the dark, in the cold, and with always the possibility of assault coming. It's overwhelming mentally, the stress. And so I think this is where we see a great reliance on faith and prayer. We see parents still instilling the values um, of perseverance in both their children. And I'll say this too, in the Gullah culture, traditions are passed on through those autonomous times together. What do I mean specifically? Mothers fixing their daughters' hair, preparing food together. That transferred all the way over 100, 150 years when on Saturday night, back in the day, and some of our audience may remember, Saturday night you got your hair washed and straightened and ready for church on Sunday morning. That was a mom and a daughter and a grandma thing. You got Sunday clothes ready. And back in the day, you cooked Sunday dinner on Saturday night. Those traditions of what made Gullah unique were passed on in those autonomous times. They were also passed on in the fields, Ashley.
Mm-hmm.
When we think about music, the spirituals, the gospels, the work ditties, all of that stuff came out of those fields, came out of the worst of times,
Mm-hmm.
and would go on to help shape America's musical palette.
Mm-hmm.
So when you think about survival and resilience, there's a whole lot of complicated layers in that.
Mhm. I'm thinking just here at Monticello, these stories that you're sharing, the archaeology that's been done by our archaeology team has unearthed cowrie shells, which are distinct to West Africa and West African cultures. They've unearthed jaw harps and fiddle pieces, and just kind of emphasizing again those cultural traditions that we may not have in the documentary record, but
Yes,
are present in the archaeological record to showcase this culture that was here and
yes.
present at Monticello.
It's interesting too, Ashley, because we need to say this, that even in the horror of slavery, there was community,
Mhm.
there was music. John Blassingame, whose work has just touched my life so deeply, opened up a lot of the studies of what went on in the slave communities. And he's talked about the dances that
Mhm.
women did their very best to put on the prettiest thing they had, to put a ribbon in their hair, that they were courted by men who found them attractive, that there was dating. All of that, not in the 21st century way, but it happened even in the midst of the horror of what was going on. And so what we see there is a retention of those
Mhm.
skills, those practices. That came also from Africa. And on top of that, everything else that they brought, the craftsmanship, the production, they didn't learn that in the hulls of those ships. They brought it with them and they simply reproduced it here. And so what we see is a hanging on to what was most meaningful then and having it come here. I wish we could find some of the things that y'all have uncovered. Gosh, McLeod was alone, unattended for quite a little bit of time there. And it's very likely that people came and found things, and so we don't have that similar experience. But in you having it, it supports the theory that they brought things with them, and that they held on to those things, and that they continue to be found in and around Charleston.
And one of the things I like to emphasize on my tours with guests is when we're talking about the transatlantic slave trade, we're not just talking about the kidnapping and forced migration of people from Africa to the Americas. We're talking about a transition of cultures.
Absolutely,
Mhm.
absolutely. And that those cultures then would go on, what they brought would go on to help shape America.
Mhm.
We talk a lot here about High on the Hog, which was a fabulous series on Netflix that looked at the shaping of America's culinary palate. Because people always ask, what did the enslaved eat? So we talk about potatoes, we talk about sweet potatoes, yams in Africa, sweet potatoes here. We talk about pork. We talk about the vegetables. We talk about the fact that they did not have much, but what they had, they turned into things that are now considered delicacies. So, one of the things that continues to be of interest is all of the different parts of the pork. And someone asked a question one day, what in the world could you possibly do with a pig beyond bacon? And it opened up a conversation around pigtails, pig feet, its snout, and something called hog head cheese, which many people don't know is a bit of a huge delicacy here in Charleston. And you would prepare it, boil it with onions and what do you call it, green peppers. And so it gelled, almost like I want to say it was like a pate consistency. And you slice it, and you would have that over grits. You would have that over rice and it would sustain you. So, what we did with the food was make it work and make it last. I was reading the other day about something called the hung cake, which would be cooked under the embers. So, as people were out in the fields working, they would leave it so when they came in the evening, they would have something to put in their stomach. That they would gather fruits and vegetables, pecans, and have those for a bit of burst of energy. Anything they could use to sustain, all of that came from what they were doing at home. And let me emphasize this, they didn't learn it in the hulls of those ships. They brought it with them. Transference of culture and the impact on culture today.
And as you're emphasizing, it sounds like too enslaved women were the backbone of creating that culture and also passing that on to future generations.
It's so interesting too when I think about if you think about their journey and you think about your own family. I suppose we all, to some degree, have a couple of women who have shaped us so mightily, right? I think about Miss Maddie and her impact on the greats, and the great greats. We had the privilege of having her seventh generation grandson here. And I tell you, Ashley, to see that little guy running and jumping and having fun, it did our hearts so good because it reminded us of Leah and the childhood that was lost. So for Miss Maddie, she would become the fulcrum around which her family would flow. I think often about Miss Robertsina. Now, she didn't have children, but she had a community of supporters. She mentored so many young women, and she would go on to become an evangelist. So she had a lot of spiritual sons and spiritual daughters. So she then passed on what she knew to other people. Leah, she didn't have as long, but what she had, she gave to her daughter Lizzie. We have a picture of Lizzie as a very young woman. And then, of course, she would pass on to her granddaughter. It speaks to something that y'all are doing, and it really set a standard, and that is the collection of those oral stories and testimonies, because that's how we know what went on, because it was passed down from great grandma to grandma and on and on. And so it just, the onus is on us now to capture all of that. And the sad part of it, Ashley, is people are getting older. And if you don't capture those stories while they're here, then they're gone. It's very much akin to what is that saying? When an elder dies, you lose a library.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit more about the oral history that y'all are doing at McLeod? It sounds like that's kind of bringing in a lot of information about how you all know the stories that you know for the site.
It's it's um it's a joyous, fun, challenging thing to do, um, because part of capturing it is taking people at their word, face value, and not infusing your own biases into that. So, in talking to people, one of the first things that we want to do is hear clearly what they're saying and where they're coming from, and not run it through the filter of our own minds. And that can be a little challenging when the gullah is very, very heavy and you can't make it out. One of our dear friends, Mr. Eugene Frazier, has helped us tremendously. He wrote a book about the enslaved people on James Island. I can't tell you how many times we have referred to that book because he's captured their stories. And in revealing what he's learned, it has helped us fill in the blanks about so many people who actually lived and walked here at McLeod. Last year, we had a gentleman come on the property. His name was Coach Matthews. And he was out walking in the rain down Transition Road. The Welcome Center called and said, "There's a man outside. You need to go talk to him." And when I went out to greet him, he said, "My uncle lived in that last cabin." And I said, "You're kidding." He said, "Nope. And I want to come back and tell you about it, but I can't right now because my heart is so full." So I got his number, and a few weeks later he came back, and actually we went in that cabin. And Coach Matthews, he's a big guy. He's maybe about 6'4", 300 pounds, strong football player. It took everything he had not to break down when he stepped foot in that door, because it immediately took him back to that 7 or 8 year old boy that he was when he lived there. And as he walked room through room, he began to share what he was remembering and what he was feeling, and how all of that contributed to him becoming the man that he was today. And so we captured all of that, and we had his transcript done. And every so often I pull it out and read it just for inspiration, because I'm thinking about how many other people whose stories we won't know. And we're at a bit of a disadvantage in that we don't have the McLeod records per se. We have William Ellis, but a lot of the people who lived here at that time were renters. So once they were done renting, they moved away, and of course, there's no forwarding address, there's nothing of that sort. His father, Willie Jr., we don't have any of his documentation. And of course, William Wallace the First, we don't have his journals, which were most likely destroyed during the war. So we are heavily dependent on people who remember people who lived here. I've got several back channels going of some 90-year-olds who lived here and who remember other people who lived there. But we've got to overcome a little bit of reluctance about sharing those stories, and that requires trust and that requires time. So I do believe we're going to capture more and more of them. And when we do, it would be nice one day to have the descendants come back and have a reunion of sorts and to share that. I'm hoping that that would be something gratifying for them. I think it would be for us as well.
The other thing is, as you're talking, I'm thinking about is you're mentioning how emotional it is for descendants often when they visit McLeod.
Mhm.
And I think that reminds us that when we're talking about a site of enslavement like McLeod or like Monticello, these are sites of pain and trauma. And it reminds me of a interview that was done with a descendant here at Monticello, when she was talking about the site, and she says that her grandmother taught her about the beauty of Monticello and the wickedness of slavery, which I
Mhm.
think kind of really kind of covers this duality that we see at sites of enslavement.
No question. You know, it is both a place of incredible beauty, but a house of horror. And I would like to say this too, Ashley. It's African Americans, for African Americans, the trauma is real. We've had people to come to this property and just simply fall apart, sometimes before they even hit the door. Um, but it's also our Jewish family that comes here because they're remembering what happened. Um, it's our Native American, our indigenous family, because they come here and they are searching for vestiges of themselves, and there's nothing left. So when you talk about the pain, um, it's a very real part of this journey, and we have to be not afraid to touch it
Mm-hmm.
and to let people know we'll walk through it with them. And I like to think that um, people will leave some of that grief here. I hope that they could, and that they would take away a renewed sense of life and the history of our America, because this is American history. And that maybe they'll leave and be committed to doing some things to change this conversation going forward. That's always gratifying to us to get letters after the fact from people who said, as a result of coming, I did XYZ. Or people who say, I didn't want to be there at all, but I left feeling differently about it. To us, that's a good day's work, and it makes it all so meaningful.
And I think it's important for me, being a white woman who interprets at a site of enslavement, recognizing that I will never understand the experiences that people had at sites like Monticello, but I
Mhm.
can use my privilege and hopefully making a more equitable world.
And creating a space where people feel welcome, where they feel that what they're saying to you matters and that it matters to you and that they are valued. And that's the key. Um, this is not easy work that we do, but it
Mhm.
is so gratifying. And I like to believe that one day all of the seeds that are being planted are going to germinate into an America that reflects all of us and that finally makes peace with her past.
Reminds me of the Hamilton musical. In the very end song, he's talking about America being this unfinished symphony. It's planting seeds in a garden that you are never going to see grow.
Yeah. I think we're going to get there, Ashley. And I'm convinced that it's going to take all of us. It's not going to be easy, but it is worth the struggle.
Absolutely. Toby, I want to thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for the live stream. I want to thank everybody who's watching as well for tuning in, and we hope you'll join us next week for another Monticello live stream.
Thank you. Good to be with you. Take care.
You as well.